Okay, so this is going to be my first test podcast, and I'm going to talk about something you could call it a biological phenomenon that I've noticed recently that I haven't read a lot about, but it has to do with invasive species in my area in Idaho, notably thorny species like there's a few invasive roses and then also Himalayan blackberries. And this phenomenon has to do with the fact that these species are they're acting as nurse plants for both native and non-native species that typically are being overbrowsed by deer and elk. So, yeah, I'm going to talk about that a little bit. Okay, so, yeah. So these Himalayan blackberries, dog rose, sweetbriar rose, maybe to a lesser extent the cutleaf blackberry. These are all invasive species to Idaho, so they're non-native. Most of them are from Europe and Asia, and they a lot of people don't like them because they can take over areas in certain situations. They can displace native plants. But something I've realized as I've been out and about, both on my property, on other people's properties, and on public land here in Idaho, is a lot of time, especially in areas of heavy browsing pressure, so where there's a lot of deer and elk, you might say an overpopulation of deer and elk. But I've noticed that in these areas, a lot of the other native forage species, like serviceberry, black hawthorn, what else? And some non-native ones like apples and pears. But these thorny shrubs are actually helping to protect a lot of these other browse species from being overbrowsed down to nubs. Like, for example, on my property, I have a lot of dog roses. There's these big, maybe 10 to 15 foot high rose bushes, and they're pretty dominant on my property. You might call it a rose savanna because it's mostly grass and roses and there's a few ponderosa pines, but it's mostly the roses are definitely the dominant shrub. And a lot of the other species on my property, so like the native shrub species, so serviceberry, black hawthorn, and then some non-native browse species, cherry plum, apple, pear, cherry. If a little seed starts growing out in the open or in a grassy area away from any of these dog roses, they'll start growing maybe a year or two and not be bothered. But once they get above the grass, then the deer and the elk just hammer them. And there's a lot of examples of like these short little, they look like bonsai trees because they've been just eaten over and over and over by the deer and elk, and a lot of them they just end up dying off because they can't really take that much browsing, and they die. But then again, a lot of them, they end up growing either right next to a dog rose, or sometimes even under a dog rose, and the thorns on the dog rose actually protect a lot of these seedlings and saplings from being eaten by the deer and elk. So it's pretty amazing phenomenon, because you'll see apple trees and serviceberry bushes and some other things growing straight out of the middle of one of these dog roses, and once they get to about 7 or 8 feet tall, then they're above the browse line. Meaning they're above the height that the deer and elk can reach. So it's pretty cool to see, especially the fact that it's a non-native, what some people would call highly invasive species, that it does take over fields, like fields of, if it's just grass, then these dog roses, they can easily take over a field of grass and turn it into more of like a savanna type ecosystem. But on the other hand, they're really helping the native and non-native browse species that the deer and elk like to eat. They're helping them grow at least to the point where they can survive browsing pressure, because once they get above that height, then they keep growing and they have plenty of leaves and stems above the height, so they can stay alive even if the elk and the deer eat the bottom branches and the bottom leaves. Because a lot of these, like serviceberry for example, they'll sprout right from the ground, even if it's an older tree that's been growing for a while. They keep sprouting from the ground. That's just how they grow, and they'll be usually multi-stemmed. And so all these little shoots will sprout up from the ground, and then the deer and elk, they eat that stuff like crazy. That's one of their preferred foods, especially in the winter. And so, yeah, the fact that these invasive species are helping out the ecosystem like that, and I feel like in areas without any of these thorny shrub species, that a lot of these native browse, like the serviceberry and the hawthorn, they can't establish because they get eaten too quickly and they end up dying before they can really become a sustainable food source for the deer and the elk. So I like these. I like the rose bushes. There's a few other people near me, some of my neighbors, they've tried to get rid of the roses. They've used both herbicide and then they mow them down. And so it's just a big grassy field with no roses. And yeah, I can see part of it, because if let's say you're trying to use it for cattle ranching or something, maybe it might be better if the roses are not there. But even then, I don't know. I think the roses add a little bit of diversity, and they probably help the soil too. And I would imagine cattle would eat them at least a little bit, especially in the winter when there's not a lot of other food. But yeah, so my neighbors try to get rid of them. And to me, I think they're a good thing. Another great thing about the roses is, well, I guess the blackberries too, is they produce edible fruit. So there's a little red berry on the rose bushes called a rose hip, and it's amazing wildlife food. I've seen pretty much every animal eat it. on my property, like all the big, larger game species. I've seen deer, elk, bear, turkeys. I'm guessing trucker and quail and stuff would eat it too. But it's a really great food source, and it lasts pretty much all through the winter on the bushes. And so even early in the spring, there's still those little red berries on some of the bushes, and so it's a great wintertime food source when there's hardly anything else growing at that time, especially fruit. Almost all the other fruits by then are gone, but there's still those little red berries. And I've even seen bear scat in the spring, so after they've come out of hibernation, I've seen bear scat where they have those little rose hip seeds in them. So I know they're eating them in the spring, first thing they do when they come out of hibernation. So that's a great food source for bears, because there's really no other fruit that time of year, and bears, at least in our area, they rely mostly on fruit for most of the year for their food source. So that's kind of cool. And then the other one is the blackberry. They produce blackberries. They're perfectly edible, and I've eaten a bunch of them, and they're really good. I mean, some of them get as big as store-bought blackberries, like the actual berries. So that's a plus in my book. Something edible. But yeah, I think these invasive thorny species are a good thing overall, because they take over a niche in the ecosystem that isn't really doesn't really exist here in Idaho. There's a few other thorny species. We have native roses, but they're not really that drought adapted. You'll find them more either along creeks or in the woods where it's a little wetter. But these dog roses, they can grow out in pretty harsh, dry areas where the other native roses can't. So they're taking over that niche in the ecosystem that doesn't really have anything there anyways. So grass, but I mean, it kind of helps it go through forest succession. So if anyone who doesn't know what that is, it's basically the fact that let's say you plow a field. Let's say there's a meadow or something there, or a forest, and you just cut it all down, get it down to just bare earth, plow it, do whatever you need to do. And then it's like the first things that come in are weeds, and then the weeds kind of condition the soil so that other things can start growing. Depending on the area, it might be grass or bushes. And gradually over time, it'll eventually grow into a forest, because tree seedlings will start sprouting there and then grow up into a forest. And then there's different succession levels of forest. There's an early succession forest, which can only grow in full sunlight. And then there's late succession or climax forests, which come up underneath the early succession forest, and those trees can actually grow in the shade pretty well, so they don't need as much sunlight. And then once that climax forest hits, it'll pretty much be that type of forest for a long time, until some other disturbance happens, like a forest fire or logging or something like that. But yeah, that's just how nature goes. And a lot of these grassy fields around here, they'll succeed into forest eventually. So the fact that these rose bushes are you might say they're invading the grass, but really it's a natural a natural pattern that happens anyways. Yeah, it might take longer without the roses to succeed that into a forest, but eventually these grassy fields would turn into forests anyways. So, and the roses, like, they're not climax. They're just early successional species too. They eventually will get overtaken by taller trees, and actually they facilitate that. I think they speed that process up. So let's say you had a grassy field without any other trees or shrubs and no dog rose. Let's say the dog rose didn't exist in this field, and there's trees and shrubs trying to grow there, but they're having a hard time because they get eaten by the deer and elk. So these deer and elk are making that grassy field. They're preventing it from succeeding into a forest, and that's probably a sign of overpopulation of deer and elk. But it's an interesting thing to note. So yeah, I these roses and the blackberries, I like them. I'm gonna keep them on my property because eventually I want to have like more of a kind of a shrubland forest type situation on my property where I have a lot of species that are good for the deer and the elk to be growing. So I want to keep those there to kind of get rid of the grass too. I know the elk will eat the grass, and a lot of the deer eat the grass, but we're not low in grass in my area. It's not a limiting factor in the area I'm in, so I'm not worried about getting rid of the grass. But I think we do need more browse species of like shrubs and trees that the deer and the elk will eat, especially in the winter. So yeah, that's it. This is my first podcast, so this is just a test. I've never done a podcast by myself like this, so it's kind of awkward talking. Maybe I should prepare a little bit before next time, just because it's kind of don't really know what I'm going to talk about, but it's just kind of a spontaneous, see how it goes. So, well, that's it. So I hope you enjoyed, and y'all have a good day.